Okay, we're not going to really do an intro of any kind. Actually, I should probably, because not just because some of you might not know who Dr. Stu is, but some of Dr. Stu's people might not know who I am. But I'm Robin Black. I am obsessed with martial arts. And Dr. Stu McGill, you do this stuff. And you're an author. You used to be a professor, and now you specialize and have people come to your home and specialize in athletes and nervous systems.
Well, I was a professor of spine biomechanics for 32 years at the University of Waterloo and retired. And I'm like you. I love working with people and particularly pulling performance out of these bodies. And so athletes come in and people with back pain. And I just love working with them to A, get rid of their pain, and then B, try and optimize their performance, whether they are an elastic athlete like a gymnast or a very adapted strength athlete like a power lifter, or the athlete who does it all, which the athlete in my view now who does it all is the mixed martial artist, both from an energy system point of view, a psychological point of view, a joint integrity point of view, a understanding of the human body to know how to exploit a strength or a weakness both in themselves and in an opponent. They've got to be strong and durable, have explosive power. It is the biggest challenge I have. And yet, Robin, if I can just finish this one off, if I've worked with an athlete, I can't watch them in the cage.
Really?
After that. No.
Really?
As much as I enjoy the science of it, it hurts me so much. It's like watching your son get hit. But apart from that, I'll observe from a purely scientific point of view and admire the skill. But I hate the carnage.
So really, wow, because I know, now you and I met just briefly before out of a shared love of fighting and human movement and nerdiness about this kind of thing. But I didn't know that. So you actually don't even watch the fights? Like George St. Pierre, somebody publicly you've worked with before, you're not going to watch him fight?
It's going to be very, very hard on me. And I don't know. I don't know. I just remember, I forget the year, but he was fighting Dan Hardy. And I remember being in England at the time. I just finished teaching a course. And with the time difference, I was wondering, shall I stay up? And I had to teach the next day. And I remember, he had him in the arm bar. Yeah. And he should have submitted. But of course he wouldn't. And it was so hard emotionally on me.
And that was a fight George was winning most of it. But it is, I mean...
But George said afterwards, he says, I said, why did you let him go? And he says, I didn't want to win that way. It was not, I'm paraphrasing now, but it wasn't an honorable way to win. Yeah. And it is so admirable, really.
So, George, you've worked with, what other athletes, what other fighters have you worked with that say it's okay for you to talk about it? Because I know off camera you've worked with a ton. Right. And elite athletes of every...
Yeah, and I have to, how much do I work with them? Sometimes it's just simply doing an experiment to investigate what is their athleticism that allows them to be the best in the world at what they do. So it might simply be that. But it's so hard to work very closely with someone and not become friends.
Yeah,
and,
right.
That you're sharing such really intimate things about their own body and performance and whatnot. I'm not really one to mention the names of clients. They
mention you.
Some of them, of course. Yeah. We just wrote a book with Brian Carroll, who had some squat records in powerlifting. You probably can't see
him from here, but if you Google him, if you don't know, he's enormous.
So he held a record in powerlifting, and he came to me with a horrific spine injury. His sacrum was split.
Which one is this?
He had this. So if you can see this injury, we're looking inside the vertebra, and he's broken the bottom of the end plate. So when we squeeze this, we see the whole disc squeezing up inside the. Yeah, it's painted blue. This comes from Dynamic Disc Designs, by the way. I'm not associated with the business, but
you think it's cool.
Not only cool, it is. This company takes the mechanisms that we document for that cause back pain, and they make models of it. So not only did he have a split sacrum of that nature, he had a crushed L5 and very damaged discs. But if I was to show you how he came when he first saw me, the surgeons had told him that, so you can see a split sacrum, just a crushed L4, L5. But after 2 years, we did a procedure called bone callousing. He went from that and that fracture to that, which is a very impressive looking remodeling of the bone and his discs back again. So what the book was about was his recovery. And then he came back and won the Arnolds down in...
crazy. Did you go for that? He doesn't get punched in the head.
I did go down for it. I did. I showed up for the Arnolds. I with my wife went down to
you? Like, he's not taking the damage, but there's still the performance.
Oh, you asked.
Watching that?
You know what? Off camera, we talked about what it's like to walk into the cage, and it's so interesting. You've been there, and it's funny you would ask that question. I was sick.
Yeah.
I was sick sitting in the audience. He squatted 1,100 pounds. Can you imagine being out of alignment 1 millimeter and trying to correct under 1,100 pounds? So I'm there, my stomach is in my mouth, and it is when you work with these guys. So emotionally on me, I'm a wreck.
The ones that traumatize me as a fight analyst are the guys that I develop, and it's impossible to not. So I don't have to be biased any more than you do. And it's weird when you talk on television. People like, I want my news reporter or my political analyst to be unbiased. You're human beings. You're just telling people, hoping to enrich their enjoyment of the fight. I'm not sharing nuclear secrets, right? And Jorge Masvidal, for example, one of my very favorite fighters, and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. Do you know him?
I do know Stephen.
You know him personally? Have you met him?
With the whole Montreal TriStar group.
They are two of my ultra favorites, and they'll fight on the same night as George. And it's because only one of them can win, and the injury and the pain doesn't bother me as a viewer because I've experienced it, and I know it's part of it, and I know the joy in which they have to go and express their skills and their fighting and their combat and have it with somebody else brilliant. So getting hurt is part of it. It's the losing that one of them will have to lose. And that's harder to watch for me. The getting kicked in the head part, getting kicked in the head sucks, but it's like if you've been kicked in the head, you've dealt with it, you see that those guys will be all right. They're big boys.
This will surprise you. I like to roll in the cage and spar a little bit with them. Now they know they're taking it easy, but even with their 10% effort, I want to feel what it's like with whatever athlete I'm working with, so I get a little bit of an understanding.
So you wouldn't squat 1,100 pounds, but you'd squat 200 pounds.
Possibly. Yeah, possibly. But anyway, that's the fun of it all.
So you've been kicked in the leg hard?
Hard enough to know that I don't know how any human survives it, let alone multiple kicks. When you've been kicked at 10%, and how they still keep their feet underneath them is astounding to me. And just to check some of the things that these guys check, it's astounding.
So this, I think, there's so many things to talk about, and we maybe get to hang out for 45 minutes or an hour. No matter what, we're going to do it again, and we're going to do it where we can play with some of your stuff. Maybe we'll be able to do that today. But this brings me to something that I find fascinating. So somebody gets kicked in the leg, say, or somebody picks another man up or whatever. I desperately need to know how. what's the mechanism, what's the mechanics, what's happening in the body. That's part of what's driven you to study, dedicate your life to studying this, right? Is
Absolutely.
The necessity to understand the truth.
I want to understand how this machine, and people don't like me to call it that, but how does this linkage work? And why are the ones who are so much better than all the rest of it? What mechanisms do they employ or exploit or develop or whatever it is that allows them to do that? And people say, well, why would you do that? And my answer is, why would Honda build an F1 race car? Because what they learn at the elite level, they then bring down. Your Honda Civic has transmission gear change technology that was hard learned on the F1 racetrack. So I'll give you an example of this. So when I've worked with Olympic lifters and power lifters, I get a pretty good education as to how to pick up a heavy load off the ground.
Right.
Well, I was at a medical facility in England putting on a course, and as they often ask, they say, would you come and see 3 patients in front of our docs and our audience here? They brought out this woman who was...
You don't know anything about them?
I don't know anything about them.
Fine.
They just want me to play jazz on a stage and assess a patient and figure out why they have pain, because they're not figuring it out.
Right.
And this woman came on. I peg her in her middle 70s, maybe early 80s, and she was very emotional. And I spoke to her longer than any other doc had ever spoken to her. And she said, well, when I sit on the toilet and get off the toilet, they're afraid I'm going to fall. And it turned out that it wasn't that she was afraid of falling. It was that no one would find her and no one would feed her cats.
Wow.
But the therapists had told her, you're going to have to go into a patient care facility and leave your home. Do you know what I did? I went right back to Elite Powerlifting 101 and taught her how to squat. I got her on the stage and I said, put your hands on your thighs, squat back, and put weight down your hands like this. And I said, now, we're in England. So I said, pretend you're out in the field playing cricket. Now, push off and stiffen your back, and now pull your hips through. Well, there was no problem. And I said, sit down again, stiffen and pull your hips through. And I said, now, there's the toilet, sit on the toilet. Bam, she sat on the toilet. And I said, now, get off the toilet, sniff some air, spread your knees apart, get your feet underneath you, lean forward, now pull your hips through. And then this big smile came across her face. And I said, well, what's that all about? She says, do you mean I don't have to leave my home? And so there is the power of why, when you deal with the elite and understand the mechanism, teaching her Elite Powerlifting 101 meant she didn't have to leave her home. It changed her life. So there's just an example of what you learn. And
did they think you were doing voodoo? Did the crowd think you were doing voodoo?
You know, I've certainly enjoyed watching you on TV, and I've heard you say many times that martial arts allows you to know the man. It allows you to know the body, and it teaches you about life. Well, there's an example of movement, the mental discipline, the neurology. We were talking, anyway, the point is, when you study it, you learn better than any doctor, any scientist. We talked off camera a little bit earlier about one lesson that GSP taught me. And he didn't even know he was teaching, but it was just a conversation like this. And I said to George, teach me how to put on an arm bar. I'd really love that, you know, and we were just playing, and he said, boom. But he said, I watched your breath, and I wanted you to be on the outflow
on the
of
exhale.
breath, on the exhale, because when you inhale, you've just created stability, stiffness, and strength. But when you're waiting to put on that and you're waiting for the opponent, he's just a cat. And as soon as you let a little air out, boom, he's got you. And I can tell that same story. I remember talking to an NBA player, an outstanding rebounder, and he just waited, and he would feel his opponent. He'd be under, and then he'd be doing this, and he says, "What am I doing there?" He says, "I'm just waiting for that breath to go." And then as soon as the breath comes out, boom, and I'm in position and I've got it.
Amazing.
So you hear these commonalities from elite athletes, and the average coach doesn't.
So that is, what's fascinating about that for me is that's what happens once they achieve a certain amount of greatness. But the hack as to why somebody, a 16-year-old, can be better than somebody who'd been training for 20 years ago is because those things that took a lifetime to learn could be passed on in one conversation now. Do you know what I mean? Like, that commonality might have been a rare voodoo knowledge that was never passed. Now it will be passed to a 16-year-old athlete.
My head's spinning talking to you about all of these kinds of things, because what you've just described is the culture of sport. So in MMA, and the roots being the traditional pure martial arts, the way they're taught is exactly what you just described. You start with a white belt performing katas, and you repeat very slowly to create a muscle memory.
Do you know why that the katas and the groups were trained that? Because it was martial. It was military. That's how you train an army, is you get them to all stand in a line and do it that way. So it was taught at that level because this was a martial art. It was for military purposes, and we were training armies with it.
But from a neurological point of view, they were creating a muscle memory, and then they were creating what a neuroscientist would call an engram, the representation of movement. So you don't think about it anymore. You don't think about walking. You think about, all you do is you run the tape. So in martial arts, you create a tape, and then you speed it up, speed it up, speed it up. And they're taught about creating a proximal stiffness to unleash speed distally. And as I gave the example of GSP and breathing and all the rest of it. Now, if I then said to an NBA basketball player, how do you dunk a basketball? Because I've done that as well. And it's a totally different conversation. It isn't the breakdown of breath and creating stiffness here. Because they weren't taught that way. So, it might be, I woke up in the 10th grade or when I was 15 and I could dunk the ball. And it just... I
had done it 17,000 times, and on 17,001 I dunked it.
Yeah.
So that would have happened through, to a certain degree, trial and error until you accidentally became great at one time, say 100 years ago. Now we can pinpoint that athlete. We can train, Rory McDonald to behave, or George St. Pierre's body and brain to behave, a nervous system to behave a particular way, and we can do it much quicker now.
I'm not going to go along with that, really, because I'm one of the few who've measured the neurology of GSP. And he has an incredible neurology, and I showed you earlier when he strikes. But it's not only GSP, it's any person who's at the top of the game, which would be the UFC. There's only one way you can create a very fast, powerful, hard-hitting strike, and that is you initiate from here, boom, and it requires a certain amount of muscle activation. But a muscle does two things when it contracts. It creates force, but it also creates stiffness. And when you're very strong, you can't move. So to learn the pulse to get the speed going, and then to increase the closing velocity, you've got to relax and shut it down. Boom! You've got to let it go.
So tell me what the double pulse is. Is that where you're
going? So the first pulse initiates the movement. Boom! And then the second pulse, and then you must relax. Boom! Just let it go. But then the second pulse is on impact, and I measure it in great golfers, people who hit a great baseball, and people who hit people. Yeah. So, we talked earlier about Bruce Lee's 1-inch punch.
This is when I knew we were going to be friends forever, was when you literally said, I have a Bruce Lee library.
I do. Because when you study the writings of Bruce Lee, I mean, it kind of bothers me that people think, he was this actor in the Green Hornet, and they didn't understand, or they saw him do, some of the cheesy martial arts movies, and they didn't get it. But what his understanding of training all of these things, the 1-inch punch was the second pulse. So to learn, he's already closed the distance. And when you read his writings on that, it was because the first 2 feet is really a waste of time. But if you get the 1-inch punch correct and stiffen and boom, I mean, you can put someone through the wall.
Which he did.
With that.
Which he could demonstrate.
He did,
and people thought it was a parlor trick, but it was actually neurological expression in the exact right way to get what he was after.
It was, and he describes again how he relaxes his body until the time his fist meets the opponent, and then he puts his entire effort into, and what that does is it creates a stiffness now. Boom. Yeah, so he's not hitting you with the mass of his hand or the mass of his foot. He's hitting you with his full body weight turned to stone. And that's the double pulse. And when you
Which you studied in George.
I measured it in George, and in that study up in Montreal, we measured 6 top fighters. And of course, they all showed this neurology. They have to, by definition.
To be a top fighter.
To be a top fighter. And it's not done with muscle. The guys with the big muscles, they what we would call push their punches. So they push, and they're, and when they put... The actual impulse at the end is not sharp, and it is not as devastating as a guy who is much more modest looking and yet has this neurology. So to answer your question, that rate of relaxation, pulse, relax, and then boom, 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 is a neurology. It's very difficult to train. You either have it or you don't. Now you can enhance it.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you can improve it or enhance
Absolutely.
it. Yeah.
So, we talked off camera about stories of different athletes who came up with training methods to create this pulsing neurology, Bruce Lee being one, and that eventually led to the 1-inch punch. But,
I walked you through so we were talking, we left a lot of cool shit on the floor, like conversations, but we will do this again. We'll definitely explore it even further. But we were talking about the earth through my leg, through particularly my hip, through my core, through my body, out through the knuckles of my hand for the punch, right from the bottom. And I walked you through McGregor's punch, which is that foot comes off the ground and the weight transfers onto the front, and that contralateral arc kind of happens through his body. And you described that to me as, and he didn't invent it. It already exists. Dan Henderson's been doing it for years, but it is different. It's a different punch than that punch, right? You called it a whip.
It's partially a whip. It's a huge commitment, because there's no way to get into a nice defense after that. So you better hope it works.
McGregor tends to use it as you're hurt, fading out off the fence, and he uses pressure to push you out. He's left-handed, but if it was me, to push you out into a direction where you walk into it and he's not at threat. It's not random. It's very calculated when he expresses it.
It's brilliant.
Yeah,
it's brilliant.
But describe the mechanics as that is slightly different, that type of strike.
It very much is. It's well, you said it's like throwing a baseball. So it starts out as a storage and recovery of elastic energy, and then at the end you take the step, and then you whip your body through. You store and recover elastic energy in your hips and then across your chest. And then you throw the ball with that final whip of the wrist, which I hope you don't have in your fist because you'll break your wrist. But anyway, it's balls to the wall. There's no way to recover from that. You have to swing all the way through at that point.
But the amount of force that you're creating, if you're doing it at a low risk scenario, you're probably going to finish guys. And he's knocked out 17.
Well, more. Not only that, you've expanded your distance now of your strike zone. So it's added another foot to the danger zone. Not a foot, but whatever it happens to be. Yeah. So
interesting. So I have so many things I want to talk to you about. It's I'm almost going crazy already. But
so am I.
It's really fun. But when you look at, so another thought on Bruce Lee, why I'm so interested in him, is he actually, so my job, I analyze martial arts, combat, what they're doing, how they're doing it, why they're doing it, how their brain is working, how the biology is working, what they're thinking, where it came from, why it works, what's forgotten and what has never been discovered, and all of that stuff together. And that is to analyze martial arts. But Bruce Lee's really the first real martial arts analyst. Whether people consider how he fought, he was analyzing what was happening in those moments and even discovering an understanding that may never have existed.
I would agree 100%. So this discussion that we're having about proximal stiffness working its way through a linkage to create a whip, bang neurology, which is a pulse. How many people talk about muscle sequencing and pulses? They don't. They talk about the force and strength of a muscle, but he was already light years ahead talking about the pulsing of muscles, and he incorporated it into his training. You know, we talked about kime and kettlebells and things. He was doing this in the 70s, which was brilliant.
There are times where I will spend absurd amounts of time studying a particular concept and think I've discovered something, and then I'll go back and read something and Bruce Lee knew it in the 70s, and I'm just reproving something that he had theorized in the 70s. It's quite mind-blowing, actually. You dedicated your life to the study of the nervous system, and later with George St. Pierre in 2008 or 2010 reproved what this man was doing in the 70s.
Right.
That's insane.
Yeah, put a mechanism and a layer of explanation on it. But you're right. The masters have known this. Probably the masters have known this long before Bruce Lee's time. But it was his eloquence and understanding. These are quite heavy engineering concepts.
Yeah. And that's what's so beautiful and incredible about martial arts is there's truth there. Like, you are discovering truth. You're uncovering truth. You know, you're panning for truth as you study it. It hit me again when you said that you can't watch a lot of it. To me, that's like a crime. Like, you're seeing the moments where what their jazz is happening. But you will study it and understand it in this setting, but you don't watch a great deal of it when it's happening.
No, I won't watch a great deal of it. In fact, I'm not a sport fan, and this will surprise a lot of people. That's my day. So I'm dealing with that in my job, so to speak.
But you love your job.
Of course I do. But when I've worked with an athlete, I can't stand to see them get hurt, because I know what it's like for them to leave the dressing room, walk through that stadium, and get into the cage. This is such, I mean, when you really talk about it, here's the thing. You know, when you're afraid, I'm afraid of heights. So when I go up on the roof, I walk, my knees lock up. I can't move. I'm afraid. I've got to sit on the roof for 5 minutes. So think of this, and you've been there, so I know who I'm talking to. When you walk from the dressing room, you're afraid. You might die in there. Now, you have to be loose, because as soon as you get afraid, you tighten up. Now, you're frozen. You try throwing a punch when you're afraid, you can't do it. So the emotional battle of just walking to the cage and staying loose that is such, to me, because I understand this. Right. To the average fan, they wouldn't get that.
I agree. It's a challenge. So a challenge for me now is trying to find the right language, because I don't just want the most curious martial art mind to find a neat new thing. I want somebody who kind of sometimes watches fighting. I want to be able to give them something interesting without them thinking I'm just talking mumbo jumbo, which people do think. We can have a conversation like this, and there would be some people, depending on where they're at for their comprehension, would think we're just literally talking nonsense. And finding the way to communicate that is my eternal challenge, to communicate it in a way. And so I do long, deep dives into different things for years in my study, and the psychology and the brain chemistry and the understanding of the flow state and stuff has been a big one for the last few years. And the way that I've got to try to explain it recently is that when fighting, you will access this altered state. Some will call it a flow state, but you essentially access an altered state in which you can hit a fastball, or you can perfectly express jazz, or you can be creative. But if you are jarred from that state at any moment, you are literally in the middle of a car accident. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, that you have created an altered state. People who, when they were a teenager, took mushrooms, or there's many ways people have experienced an altered state. And you're in one that is the only reason these men are able to do what you're seeing. And if they lose that at any time, lose their footing in that, they find themselves in a car that's being wrecked as they get smashed in front of everybody in their underpants. That's what's happening.
It is so interesting to... when you're working with these folks and they say, the only time I'm truly alive is in the octagon. And that's a phenomenal, but you see, that's why you're the announcer and I'm not, because you just said it so much more eloquently. So when you say it's your challenge, man, you're hitting it. That was exactly the way to describe it.
It's still the challenge. So, and this is a sidetrack, but... So you've been a professor. You're now retired from being a professor. How many books do you have? This is your sixth or seventh?
No, that's really technically my fourth. Okay. I've been co-authors of many others, but that's the fourth one.
And people come to you, and which I'm sure is a thrill, that you'll find somebody who has something that they can't, that many people can't solve, and that's a permanent something you need to solve.
Right.
But when you were teaching and lecturing and writing, to find a way to be able to express these ideas in ways that make sense to a high-level audience and a mid-level audience, I want to be able to have, like on TSN, for example, someone might come from the CFL. Literally, they were watching the CFL, and I want them to be able to get something magical out of talking about fighting. How do you work on that, the expression of the language? How do you train that, or how do you...
Well, quite often, when I was teaching students, I'd get them down to the front, and we did a lot of demonstrations, and we would play with a concept. And I mean, I'm going to be very unpolitic now, but in some ways, I don't miss the university. People say, "Oh, you loved it. Don't you miss it?" In the last year I was teaching there, I bookended the program. So I was the first professor they saw. I taught movement, just movement, straight out of high school.
They called it kinesiology?
It was a kinesiology program, but the first course was this introduction to movement. And the university says to the students, you should bring a laptop computer if you're going to be a student. Well, a lot of them would come into the first lecture and they would open up their laptops and they'd all be waiting, and I'd write a piece of nonsense on the board. And they'd all copy it down. And I said, well, what did you write that down for? Well, what does it mean? And it doesn't mean anything, you know. Yeah. And we would just start to play jazz. What is movement? What's the neurology? What do the muscles do? All these kinds of fun things. And I would purposely create a logic that they couldn't type. It would be an arrow to here. Now that variable modulates or is the foundation for this. So it would be charts and diagrams and developing these things. Anyway, I said, would everybody close your computer? Now put it away. We're done with that.
Yeah,
Get
amazing.
out a piece of paper and we're going to develop a logic and a flow and a way of thinking about movement. Well, the teaching resources people came to see me. Professor McGill, you're not allowed to ban computers from your classroom. And I said, well, I just did. Because you show me one study that says they learn better typing on a laptop. Yeah. Because every study shows it is not retained that way. Anyway, so how do I get the point across? I do it through demonstrations. I want people to feel it in their body. So I might let's lock up and we're going to have an arm wrestle. Yeah. So the first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to get you to look at me a bit. I'm going to tell you a joke and I'm going to get you to smile and laugh. And right away, the density of your neural drive out of your brain to excite your muscles into strength is broken the minute you have a happy demeanor. So the game face densifies the neural drive. So I would use every dirty trick. And then I would, but you see, I just gave a whole lesson on mechanics and neurology by teaching an arm wrestle, by showing the advantage and disadvantage, putting in every element that affects the movement and performance. By the end of that lecture, They
Yeah, we'd
were
learn
very
something.
wise.
Yeah, right.
But I could say, oh, well, you know, the biochemical pathway of this chemical and that chemical. Who really? You know?
Write that down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
But,
true.
you know, again, I want you to take my grandmother now and get her to squat up off the toilet with no knee pain, no hip pain, no fear of falling, and change her life. Now, there's your task.
Yeah.
So do you see how it's a very powerful, I thought, way to teach? Now, they would go home and say, okay, I wonder more about densifying that thought, that neural drive. Now they go hit the books and they can get out the computers and do all the rest
that's
of
a really good point. Start with an idea. Curiosity is the most powerful teaching tool.
Yeah.
If you make somebody curious about something, they'll go learn, they'll go explore it. Yeah. Wow.
So anyway, I would usually start with a problem or a situation, or again, nothing more powerful than to do something with their own body.
Yeah.
And then they'll say, oh yeah, I see why doing my habit is causing me neck pain, or why my habit is doing this. But now they have a reason why they are going to change their habit, why and how are they going to change it, et cetera, et cetera.
What's this? We were talking about this.
Well, we were having some fun. Everyone's heard of core stability.
Yeah.
There's 3 elements to core stability and why it's so important.
So we're fighting, and I'm pushing you against the fence. If I have a much more stable core than you do, I'm going to start taking over positional control. You're not going to be able to resist me.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. Well, let's just finish off that idea now. So let's just have fun.
Okay.
And I'm going to do, say, a neck drag. So I'm going to get up into contact here. Now, what's the first fundamental movement I'm going to do is a drop step.
Right.
A drop step.
Yeah.
Now, I've created a link by dropping this hip back with latissimus dorsi and a grip. Do you see how it's all a chain now? Now, if I have a wonky core and I do a drop step, that did nothing. Right. But as soon as I lock my core, whoa, you're done. Or just what you did. If you were snapping that into an arm bar, if you didn't use your hips through a stiffened core, there would be nothing there. But when you lock up with a stiffened core and you pull through with the hip, this is the mother of all power. And to unleash that, you need a stiffened core.
We got a high crotch and we go to drive somebody up. We're on the ground and we want to stand up. I throw a punch. Anything connects.
That was perfect. So you just drove with the hip through a stiffened core. Yeah. Exactly.
So this is in...
See, again, I love watching. You're a little hard on me there for not watching Marshall. I love watching.
I'm not. No.
And understanding. I don't like to see guys get
That's
hurt.
no. I'm not. I'm sorry if I was hard on you. I'm actually find it curious, like just so curious, because to me, that's what I'm, ultimately I will study and chat, but in the end, I'll see the reality of it unfold. And this is a side thought, but we're obsessed when the audience is obsessed with the outcome as if that explains everything. But the moments in there are teaching us so much. Every moment. Sometimes something will happen for 7.5 minutes and then one thing will take place, the person will win, and that's the outcome. But it's every one of those seconds leading into it between the two, non-cooperative dance partners where you see it expressed and you see it, you can learn it.
I'd rather...
But you just don't want to see them get punched in the face.
Right. I would much rather roll with them in the cage and drill that form until it's technically perfect. And then put some chaos into it. So now they have to deal with the chaos. But the average fight fan looks to the ultimate final expression of all of that. And I'm interested in everything leading up until the final expression.
And we have so much that we're fascinated by, but I like it all, including the end, but I see what you mean. I think for me, the moments when they fight are like the celebration of all of the study and the history and the knowledge. I'm also really curious about the behavior, that if we all train a particular way, that becomes the truth until somebody else sees that that's our truth and they'll exploit that in their thinking or their training. But that's not as true necessarily in the truth of the body, right? If everybody trains a particular way and it's the correct way, it'll stay the correct way.
But there is no correct way. Yeah, it's so interesting. If we were to take Okinawan karate, the people of Okinawa are the tallest people in the world when they're sitting down. And what that means is their torso length to their leg length proportion means they have the shortest legs and longest body ratio. Well, look at Okinawan karate and the hip tosses and low hips always wins with that particular style. So would that work for a guy like me who's long-limbed, all legs? No, it probably would not. So there would be a much greater distance to it, would be a mechanical advantage.
But your hips would be too high a lot of the time.
They would, and for jiu-jitsu, again, I've got deep hip sockets, so I would be lousy in the guard, always have been.
So what'll be the best for you? Savate.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Yeah, long distance.
Yeah.
But with me, just run away.
Yeah. I got this was the single greatest learning experience in my life. Although this will going to be one of my top 10 today, and not just what we got a chance to talk about, but was I got to commentate for 19 days. It was like 16 different martial arts at the World Combat Games in St. Petersburg over 19 days, and there were times where I'd have to go from commentating savate, which is a French kicking sport that was that sort of evolved on the docks. Did you know that? And they wore shoes because they were wearing shoes. So those were the weapons.
Yeah.
And so we'd be there for a moment, and then I'd be calling sumo an hour later, and then I'd be calling Muay Thai. And your brain was forced to start to differentiate the different, how the rule structures. And what I found, and this would have blown your mind, but every day there was a different martial art that was done. And they would be the ones, of course, that were in the bar and the restaurant because they were done. And they all had a body type because these were the greatest in the world. And the savate guys were tall like volleyball players, and the wrestlers were short and stocky and flexed over. And the Muay Thai guys were long because they run so much, among other reasons. They were thin for their weight class. And there was a gracefulness to particular ones because the way, and you could see it just by, and we were the commentators, so we were in the bar and the restaurant every night. But every night you saw the different group, and they were a different sort of classification of human being. There'd be some from the Ukraine and some from Canada, but they had that body type. Absolutely. And the Olympics are the same. Volleyball players all kind of look the same. Gymnasts all look the same. It really is fascinating.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
Well, spine stability, core stability, what is it? You must stiffen the spine to bear load, or as I just did with that demonstration, to push, to pull. Yeah. You need a stable core. So I've just created, consider the spine as a stack of oranges. There it is. But we've stiffened it by creating a tight wire down the middle. Now we can probe it, push it, it supports load. If there were hips underneath it, that would work. But if I take off the compression through that spine, in other words, the stiffness, it buckles and falls over. Now, if we took your spine out of you couldn't even hold 20 pounds. Your spine would buckle. So all the time, you have these guy wires, your oblique muscles, your abdominal muscles, your quadratus lumborum. So why do martial artists build their core? They have to create a stiffened core. Well, that's the first reason, to unleash their hips. But
I need elasticity in there as well.
Well, very much. You hear in all kinds of martial arts, you breathe behind the shield. You take a powerlifting strength versus an Okinawan strength. Put on the iron shirt. Okay, find a little element of my body that is not stiff. Try and push me over. It'd be very difficult to do.
Yeah.
So this is Okinawan strength. Chest proud strength. I'm going to lift the bar. It's not going to serve you in a martial combative situation. So you were talking earlier about the right way. Back to Bruce Lee. The right way is every way. Right.
If it works in this moment, it's the correct way.
It is. And that flow and what is right. I used to give a lecture on what is optimum. And the optimum criteria changes by the second. So I might bend a certain way because I'm tired and I want to spare a muscle. Or I was out the night before, I had too much beer, and now my head's pounding. I'm going to move in a way to minimize blood pressure and my headache. Or I'm going to move in a way to spare my elbow that just got tweaked. Right. So
I'm
what
going
is
to
optimal?
compensate for a sore foot. Or I have a hangnail.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what is optimal is always a moving target. And that is the flow. Once again, that is so fun. And you as a commentator, I mean, I keep coming back to this, Robin. You impressed me so much because you get all of this.
I'm obsessed with it, right? And I need the answers, and they take years to find, but in the search, you find other things. When I told the guys at Bang Fitness, where I trained this morning, that you had sought me out because you liked my work, they were all blown away. Like, I could never be cooler for 5 minutes than when I told the guys at the gym that you liked my work, which is a huge compliment. It means a lot to me.
Vice versa. Yeah. I'm having a ball doing this.
Yeah, me too. I wonder if we should try to touch on one or two sort of specific things that people will find interesting, and then circle back and think about a few things to come back after I go to China. But what else were we chatting about? There was something you talked to me about the spine of a sprinter, and then when you see MMA fighters try to sprint, and it made you laugh tell me a little bit about the spine of different athletes.
Yes.
I got this one.
That one will do me.
We got so many crazy things.
Yeah. Okay. When you watch an Olympian, and you said the different martial artists have different body types, and so do the athletes. So when you see a sprinter, the physique you will see is a lot of curve in the low back like this, which turns the pelvis like this. Because to sprint, you have to express the extensor power out the back. Like there is the sprinting motion. So do you see it's a great advantage? If I can turn the pelvis through changing my spine, I get more power out the back. But a sprinter would be very difficult to kick you in the head because now I need a flattened back, turn the pelvis to kick high. Or if I was going to play in guard, I would need a flattened spine to get the hips into flexion to go into playing the guard.
So the good martial artist has a much flatter spine than, say, a sprinter.
That's almost universal. You will see now obviously you see the rare exceptions in sport, and these are just people who've been touched by the hand of God, as we say. But that is when you think of the combatives, it's more of an advantage not to have a lot of lordotic curve in the back, but have a little bit of a flatter one. Bring the hips around for knees, for kicking, for wrestling, for
dropping down my hips, and
get on and off the floor quickly. A flatter back would be an advantage than a lot of lordosis.
I have many questions. Over time,
if I can just finish that thought off now, let's parlay that into training. So some of the martial artists years ago that would come to me, they'd be sprinting. And you would laugh. And it wasn't their thing, and you could see it. So they would try and develop their explosive anaerobic, and then try and build some endurance by repeated sprints. That probably wasn't the optimal way to do it. I've never seen a fighter sprint in the octagon. And here's another thing too. When I first started working with the fighters, I would say to the coaches, "What are we training for?" And they'd look at me, "What?" And I said, "Well, you tell me exactly what we're training for, and I will go pick the training tools that will be optimal."
I want my fighter to accelerate faster off the ground, or I want
that's not how they spoke. No,
I want my guy to win fights.
Kind of. And they would go back to, we'll do a little bit of jiu-jitsu training, a little bit of, in other words, technique. But I was the guy who had to figure out the movements and train them. So I would watch the fights, and I know I watch a bit more than maybe you think. And now remember Roger Nielsen?
But like this a little bit.
Not exactly, but
there's a lot of
it comes. It's come with age. It's come with age. I've become a lot more cognizant of, I'm in my 60s now. I want to be here with less pain.
Right.
And,
fair enough.
we all banged when we were 20.
Right.
And it's a little...
Yeah. So this, I don't want to get into like dark stuff, but my belief is that we should educate a football player, a fighter, of the true risks, so that they can make a real decision. And if you're obsessed, this is who you are and this is what you were put on earth to do, know the risk and go do it, sir. Go enjoy it.
Yeah, but, I don't know even if I would go that far.
Wow.
Yeah. My general approach to everything is give the person the information that they need to know, and it's then up to them to make the decision, informed decision. But I don't always know what the risks are in sport, because I see some people in some sports. I mean, I had a squash player not too long ago that really wrecked their pelvis by doing so many loaded lunges. They created so much laxity that so they would do a lunge and you see it bends the pelvis this way here and this way that, do you see? And then they became so lax and they had trouble walking. So when I did this, it created excruciating pain when I did this on their hips.
Wow, brutal.
So,
because this is you, like this is you. Do you know what I mean?
Oh,
like,
it is.
Like, this isn't my thumb is sore. This is all of you.
It is.
Yeah.
But it really illustrates why people have disabling pain, and they get them doing too many. I can have an Olympic discus thrower that has made themselves quite disabled. So, what's the risk between that and MMA, where someone comes out and they've toughened their body, they're resilient. So do you see? It's such a hard thing all the time,
especially when your job is to repair them. So you see the
prepare and repair.
Yeah, right. And if the better job you've done of the first, the less you have to do of the second.
Usually.
Yeah. Which means that in the future, that the better that athletes know that, the more protected they should be, but it'll also make them stronger, faster, better, more athletic, which means in fighting they can hurt each other more. It's a rough one. It is. So I, as you mentioned, I fought a little bit and have trained, martial arts since I was 7. It is, after my wife, the most important thing to me. And I would not trade that for anything, no matter what. And you just hope that everybody who does things that are somewhat dangerous, and that includes somebody who works in a mine or does any dangerous job, understands the risks and chooses it because they get a choice in it. And if you do, then we live in a free society with personal freedoms, and I believe, go in and do that thing.
Well, as I said earlier, when you meet, there's those fighters who do it and they're not 100% committed, and they're very good and they can get by on it. And then there's the other ones. They are born fighters and they've learned that to survive on the street in everyday civil society, don't ever get in a conflict. Because you're just that much more skilled than everybody else. Just avoid it all, and people will come and test you. So that they do and must become the nicest guys. They have to be to survive.
Aren't they? You've met so many of them.
Oh, they're fantastic people, but they have a switch. And when that switch flips, I mean, I've seen it a few times, but you see it in every great athlete.
Pride.
You'll see it in, I told you my wife is an elite rower, and you see the elite rowers in the rowing community. If someone's coming up to their boat, they will not let that person pass. They will row. Yeah. They will die before they let. Yeah. So that's a killer instinct. But the fighters, they flip that switch. They go into the altered state, as you eloquently described it. And then they become alive. Right. And they will say, it's the only time I'm alive. Well, I kind of wish that, some people get alive when they have 3 beers. Right. Other people go into the cage. So who are any of us to say, boy, that's the time when they're alive?
Yeah. Yeah, you can eat as much sugar, salt, or red meat as you want, and that can be just as dangerous. You can smoke as many packs of cigarettes as you want. So this is the one that they're alive. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So you see the struggle all the time. It's a struggle.
That struggle and struggles like that are a part of what it is to study something on that deeper level. It also, tell me if you feel this way, or if you have at different times as you've studied something with such specificity, like so specialized, that there are periods of your life where you get to gather so much information that you realize suddenly how little we really know about things. Do you go through periods like that?
Well, I teach clinical courses now that I'm retired to people with clinical degrees, physios and docs and chiros and trainers and this sort. And I will teach them for 2 days and tell them quite a bit. But I'll say, thank you for coming. I hope each of you found a little something that was mildly useful or entertaining. But with every experiment that I've done in my life, and I've done hundreds and hundreds, we might learn something really interesting, but I get 5 more questions. So with every experiment that I did, I've become progressively more ignorant. And now I'm not qualified to talk to anybody about training and the back and back pain and performance enhancement and this kind of thing. So my final message is never follow a guru.
Yeah, I agree.
You become very limited. Keep pulling in from all of these people, and what you will find is your questions actually grow. So the more you study, the more relatively ignorant you become. And I'm so ignorant now, I don't know why you're wasting your time talking to me.
I just got dumber thinking about it. It is exactly why I will study the martial arts for the rest of my life. It's also a part of the nature of how the study of martial arts is shared is through television and sport. And people will be like, who's your pick, this guy or this guy? And the more I study, the more variables I see. You talked about a hangnail will change the way the body mechanics work. And if a guy ate the wrong sausage yesterday at his post-weight cut, and somebody really believes they have the knowledge to pick one of these two fighters, knowing that everything changes in every moment, the more you learn, the less you know. Which is beautiful. It just means you'll do it forever.
Yeah, well, it's if that's how you get your jollies, it never ends.
It's right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. It's been a real pleasure, Dr. Stu. Thank you for having us in your place. And we can do this again, please.
I love talking to you, Robin. Fantastic. I got a new brother.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. And your book, where can people get it? Gift of Injury, where can they get it?
Yeah, that's the latest one, Amazon. Yeah. Well, I've written a few. If they have back pain, read Back Mechanic. I can give you some statistics because we follow up. Of those people who've been told they need surgery to fix their back pain, 95% of them don't after following the program. Not everybody, but 19 out of 20. But my most recent book is Gift of Injury. It's the story of Brian Carroll, who had the horrific back injury, how he recovered and came back and won the Arnold's and squatted, I think it was over 1,100 pounds again. So a back injury isn't a life sentence.
Is your book your study around George and the double pulse, is that observed in any of your books?
Yeah, it is actually. I have a book. So once a person gets out of pain and they've left Back Mechanic, I then suggest if they want to train, go to Ultimate Back Fitness and Performance. That's where I tell the stories of many athletes from many different sports, how they produced their athleticism. So GSP is certainly in there. Among many others, but to show how you build fundamentals of athleticism, tuning the body. You will love this. Well, another day we'll have to talk about tuning the body, getting the stability and the mobility blend just tuned right. So
like a string on a guitar.
Well, as I showed you earlier, there's an athleticism. I'm going to push you with muscle, but now I'm going to load a tissue elastically. That is an athlete. That is the average guy on the street.
We'll look into that, and I'll try to come with a couple of cameras so we can do some things physically too.
Fabulous.
Brother,
look forward to it. Yep. Take care.